Do you have any moments when you reflect on the past and question how things went so wrong? Sitting in my new apartment, which is roughly half the size of our master bedroom, I am currently trying to pinpoint the precise moment I damaged the best thing that has ever happened to me. I'm 32-year-old Ashley, and I'm going to share with you how my inability to deal with fears caused my marriage to fall apart. 3 years ago, Michael and I met at my college roommate's wedding in Michigan. Another bridesmaid contracted food poisoning, so I was moved up to the main table even though I wasn't meant to be there. He appeared to prefer being somewhere else while seated opposite from me in this immaculately made navy suit. He was different from the other people I typically pursued, the slick talkers who would woo you and then leave you 2 weeks later. In contrast to my ex-boyfriend Dylan, who was constantly talking about the bar he was definitely going to build someday, Michael genuinely had his life together and owned 2 restaurants in downtown Detroit. He didn't make a big deal out of it, either. He would simply respond that he worked in restaurants when people inquired what he did. Later, I had to learn from the bride that he had completely rebuilt both locations. I'll be honest. Michael's stability was very alluring following a series of relationships with men who couldn't keep their electricity on. In addition, he exuded a serene confidence that gave me a sense of security. He didn't play games when he asked for my number, for example. The following day, he called and invited me to supper at this adorable downtown Italian restaurant. After that, we made quite quick progress. I understand that some people felt that moving in together at 6 months was premature, but when you know, don't you? Perhaps, in hindsight, I was a bit too eager to combine our lives. Even though I was competent at my position, after a few years of working at Nordstrom, I felt as though I had finally found my ticket to the life I want after watching Michael manage his companies. He didn't appear to mind that I had high-end tastes. In fact, at first, he found it adorable when I became thrilled about my designer purchases. He would reply, "You deserve nice things because you work hard." I loved that about him. Unlike my ex, who would roll his eyes whenever I brought a shopping bag home, he never made me feel guilty about desiring the nicer things in life. After a year, we were married, and it was wonderful. Almost perfect, actually. Michael insisted on having a smaller wedding, even though I had intended a larger one. He claimed that using the funds for a down payment on a home made more sense. I was too engrossed in the romanticism of it all to see that it should have been my first indication that we had different perspectives on money. It felt like a dream during the first year. I felt like I had finally made it when Michael's enterprises were going well, and we purchased this stunning colonial in a pleasant suburb. No more living with roommates in a small apartment or counting down the days until payday. I had a husband and a walk-in closet larger than my first bedroom. I intended to repaint the entire first floor, and I didn't bat an eye. But as they say, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. Yes, I became aware of small details, such as the fact that Michael would spend hours reviewing the restaurant's records, but seldom ever look at our shared credit card bill, or that he would become excited when I spoke of his ambitions to grow the business but lose interest when I mentioned the new Gucci collection. I made an effort to integrate myself into his professional life by attending business gatherings and charity dinners, but I felt alienated as I stood there wearing my well-chosen attire and heard everyone discuss profit margins and overhead expenses. I was the girl who left community college after 3 semesters because I found it too dull, while these people had degrees in business and hospitality management. I started shopping more to feel better as Michael's success increased. A fresh outfit for every occasion, matching shoes and bags that would demonstrate my inclusion in his world. I opened a few credit cards in my name alone because I didn't want to bother him with the specifics. Not because I was hiding anything, I told myself. He had enough to occupy him. In hindsight, I can see that the ideal start wasn't really that great. The problem is that when you're preoccupied with maintaining appearances and attempting to be the person you believe your husband should be, you fail to notice the fractures that are developing beneath the surface. I didn't understand. I was gradually ruining my place in Michael's universe because I was too preoccupied with trying to fit in. What I see now is something I wish I had noticed back then, but I suppose that's getting ahead of myself. The actual issues had not yet begun. Michael's company was about to expand even further, and I was going to discover how insecure I actually was. Things really began to alter during that second year of marriage. When Michael was given the chance to start a third restaurant, I felt as though I had vanished from view. He had arrived home late and was so tired that he had hardly eaten dinner before dozing off on the couch. He simply nodded as he browsed through his phone's emails as I tried to share my day with him. I know it's hard to run a business, but how about managing a marriage? I was always told how fortunate I was by my buddy Rachel. I knew she was correct, but she didn't have to sit by herself at dinner parties explaining why her spouse was AWOL once more. At least Michael's actually working, she would tell me, not sitting at home playing video games like my ex. She didn't have to watch her friends' husbands surprise them with lunches at work. During my work breaks, I began to spend more time at the shopping center. You know, there's something about purchasing something new that lifts your spirits. I felt as though every purchase was filling a growing void inside of me. I would tell. I had to pretend to be the wife of a successful restaurant owner. What if I showed up to his business dinners wearing the same dress twice? I kept reminding myself that it was only temporary, even though the credit card bills were becoming frightening. Everything would return to normal after Michael's new eatery opened. We'd joke about how difficult this time was, and he'd start listening to me again. We could afford it, and his business was going well. I told myself that every time I increased the limit on my secret cards anyway. The fact that everyone was gushing about how great Michael was doing didn't help either. They would remark on things like, "Your husband is such a genius with restaurants," or "You must be so pleased with his success." I was proud, of course, but would it be cruel of them to occasionally inquire about my life? I feel as though I would marry Michael rather than Ashley. I made one attempt to discuss it with him. I prepared his favorite dinner, waited, he got home for it, and tried to communicate how lonely I was. Do you remember what he said? "Perhaps you ought to consider returning to school. Find something you're passionate about." I thought that unless I was as driven as he was, my sentiments weren't legitimate. As if desiring my husband's attention and doing a good job weren't enough. I became aware of our differences at that point. Spreadsheets and profit margins delighted Michael. Me? Planning dinner parties that he would most likely miss and the new seasonal collections at work delighted me. 5 a.m. was when he would awaken to attend supplier meetings, and I would watch reality TV late at night, since at least those couples were spending time together. Seeing my friends get married and wondering where we went wrong was the worst part. Even though he didn't manage his own company, Rachel's husband was present for weekend breakfasts and Taco Tuesdays. Even the mechanic boyfriend of my younger sister was able to take her out on dates on a regular basis. If Michael arrived home in time to bid me good night, I was fortunate. In the hopes that he would notice, I started dressing up more when I went to see him at the restaurant. New clothes, flawless makeup, the works. However, he simply kissed me absently and returned to whatever problem required his focus. Only when the credit card statement arrived did he actually appear to notice what I was wearing, and even then, he was too preoccupied to do more than raise an eyebrow and murmur something about talking about it later. Naturally, later never arrived. There was always something more important than me, and he was too busy with staff training, vendor meetings, and menu planning. I began to question whether I was no longer successful enough for him, as if he were out there creating an empire, and he regretted marrying someone who folded sweaters for a career. In retrospect, I realized that I was engulfed in fears, but at the moment, all I could think about was the growing gap between us. Then, he hired Emma, and all of my concerns and anxieties that I had been suppressing. Questions. In the worst possible way, they all bubbled to the surface. Even the mention of Emma's name now makes my stomach turn. Michael had all the time in the world for business meetings after she entered our life with her MBA from Michigan State and her immaculately ironed jackets. I can still clearly recall our first encounter at the restaurant staff party. She was perhaps 28 years younger than me, had a no-nonsense demeanor, and was perfectly in her place. Clean-cut business attire, most likely from Express or some other store with no designer branding. My skin crawled as Michael introduced her. With a pleased parent's smile, he declared, "Emma is going to completely change the way we do things." I felt like a little girl playing dress-up as I stood there in my new Louboutins that had maxed out my Nordstrom card, saying, "She has amazing ideas for expansion." I initially made an effort to be amiable. Michael and I would stop into the restaurant for lunch, but they would be gathered over laptops, discussing this coded language of market analysis and profit margins. Even after I told Emma to name me Ashley, she would always be very professional and kind, referring to me as Mrs. Anderson. Now that I think about it, perhaps her politeness made things worse. She was this ideal employee, and I was simply the wife who didn't see my husband's world. Little things began to catch my attention. He would never miss a meeting if she was in charge of it, but he had been too busy to attend my nephew's birthday party the weekend before. Michael's face would light up when she presented fresh ideas in meetings, and he would mention her name over dinner. "Emma thinks this. Emma suggested that." I began to grow annoyed by the texts. They would arrive at any time, but they were always about work. While he was sleeping, I began to check his phone and said things like, "Great meeting today at 10:30 p.m. and excited about tomorrow's presentation at 6 a.m. Tell me you wouldn't do the same, even though I'm not proud of it." All of the communications were business-related, but they not for me. I heard him and her laughing over the phone one evening as they discussed an inside joke about their supplier. Bad. He hadn't laughed like that with me in a long time. I was unable to recall. I began evaluating myself against her all the time. I had an unfinished associate's degree. She had a business degree. She could discuss food prices and wine pairings, but I couldn't figure out which glass was for white and which for red. I only spent his money. She helped him develop his dream. Although Rachel made an effort to be encouraging, it was clear that she believed I was being overly suspicious. "They work together, Ashley. Of course they talk a lot," she said, but she failed to see the way he stared at Emma in staff meetings as if she were the only person who understood him. Whether it was a spreadsheet or his favorite coffee order, Emma always appeared to know what Michael needed before he asked, but she was blind to this fact. At odd intervals, I would drive past the eateries to see how they were doing. I would convince myself that I was being a helpful wife, but in reality, I was seeking evidence, proof that something was happening, that I wasn't crazy. I would work late into the night while sitting in my car and observing them through the windows. It was nearly made worse by the fact that nothing improper ever occurred. Every heated talk, every enthusiastic gesture over some paper I probably wouldn't understand, and every shared laugh all reflected the intimacy. The paragraph regarding the surprise then appeared. "Everything's set for the surprise next week. Can't wait to see your face," was what I saw appear on his phone one morning when he was taking a shower. Emma said it. Naturally, when I read it, my hands trembled and my thoughts were racing with potential scenarios. A private dinner, a covert meeting. The fact that I was aware that I was acting irrationally didn't matter since all I could think about was them, together, sharing something that excluded me. I began making plans for how I would approach them at that point. The hidden texts, the late nights, and the way they seemed to share this entire world that I wasn't a part of were all too much for me to handle. Although I lacked concrete proof, I did have my certainty, which was superior. Even if it meant destroying my own world, I was going to blow theirs to pieces. I decided to do it on a Tuesday evening. Tuesdays were always busy at Michael's Main restaurant because of a weekly special that Emma reportedly proposed. I put on my tightest black dress, my highest heels, and even though Michael most likely didn't remember purchasing the pricey perfume he gave me for Christmas, I put it on. Rachel attempted to dissuade me. "Ashley, consider your actions," she repeated. However, what was there to contemplate? I had evidence, sort of. He changed his phone password last month, and I received the text about the surprise and the late-night meetings. If you looked at it correctly, it all added up. I waited until I was certain that dinner service would be in progress. I wanted people to recognize Emma for who she truly was. A homewrecker with common sense who believed she could take my husband. I entered the restaurant as though I owned it, which, as his wife and all, I sort of did. And there they were, huddled over some paperwork in his office with the door open. Michael had the same delighted expression on his face that he used to save for me, and he was nodding as Emma pointed to something on the desk. At first, they were too preoccupied with whatever spreadsheet they were looking at to even notice me. "So this is the surprise, huh?" I sounding less confident than I had intended. Startled, they both looked up. The continual work talks, the late-night texts, and the covert meetups. Michael got to his feet cautiously, as if he were going up against a savage. "Ashley, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me, Michael. I saw the text about the surprise. I know it's been going on." Emma started gathering her papers, her face flushing. "Mrs. I believe there has been a miscommunication, Anderson. Do you agree?" "Mrs. Anderson? Me?" I was shouting. Now all my carefully planned accusations coming out in a jumble. "I've seen how you look at him. How you're always there, always so perfect. And professional and understanding." "Ashley, stop." "You're embarrassing yourself," Michael said in that foreboding tone of voice he used after I had overspent on the credit card. I totally lost it at that point. "Am I embarrassing myself? While your wife waits at home by herself, how about you sneaking around with your young business prodigy? At least be polite enough to acknowledge it." The surprise is the new restaurant. "Location, Mrs. Anderson," Emma said as she moved forward, her hands up as if she were giving up. "Since we're still in negotiations, we haven't disclosed that we're opening a fourth location. At next week's investor dinner, Michael intended to surprise you with the news." The room appeared to tilt sideways, as I recall. "What? Is she engaged?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear dishes clattering in the kitchen, conversations from the dining room, and the entire restaurant continuing to function, while my world collapsed. Michael's voice was quiet and disappointed as he said, "To her girlfriend Sarah, who you've met twice." Emma's face was a mix of embarrassment and pity that made me want to crawl under the desk and vanish. "I think you should go home," Michael murmured, his voice still incredibly quiet. "Let's discuss this later." "I've noticed your texts. The late nights, the meetings, those texts you saw by going through my phone while I slept." His eyes were cold now. "Because you've been tracking my location." Emma quietly left the office, leaving us alone with the mess of what I'd done. I tried one last time, but even I could hear how weak it sounded. I started to say, "Michael, But he held up his hand and said, "Not here, not now." The reality struck me then, not only about how wrong I'd been about them, but also about how suspicions and worries had been gradually ruining my marriage. "I can't even look at you right now." I drove home in a daze. My ideal confrontation became a nightmare. But the worst part was that, even at that point, a small, twisted part of me still wanted to hold them responsible for my initial feelings of insecurity. If only Emma hadn't been so flawless. If only Michael hadn't been so aloof. That night and the following day, Michael failed to return home. And on the third day, he arrived with boxes and a blank look I had never seen before. He didn't yell. which somehow, but instead just began packing his things as I followed him around the house, attempting to explain, to apologize, and to make him understand how everything had appeared to me. He finally said, "I found the credit card statements," without even looking at me as he folded his shirts. To a suitcase, all of them. I thought, "What do you mean?" He pulled out a folder, labeled and organized because of course it was, and dropped it on the bed. "Ashley, 4 secret credit cards and $43,000 in debt that you never told me about, and you have the audacity to accuse me of being dishonest." I tried to explain that I felt pressured to look like the wife of a successful restaurant owner, but even I found the words sounded phony. He closed his suitcase and said, "The apartment is paid through the end of the month. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the rest." Then I realized, wait, what? What apartment? The one you're moving into. I'm keeping the house. It's in my name, and I can prove I made all the payments. You should be grateful I'm covering the first and last month's rent somewhere else. He was obviously right about everything. The house was his. The life I'd been living was based on his success. And my lies. Nevertheless, I still felt like the victim in some way. If he had been more careful, would I have needed to shop to feel better? If he hadn't worked so much, would I have become so paranoid? After that, Rachel stopped returning my calls. It turned out that she and her husband had been at the restaurant that night and had witnessed the entire event. "You need help, Ashley," she texted me. "Professional help." She seemed to be judging with ease because her husband was always there and always present, and she had no idea what it was like to compete with someone like Emma. I wasn't prepared for the wake-up call that came with moving into the apartment. My walk-in closet was gone, replaced by a tiny room that couldn't fit half of my designer clothes. There was no longer a luxurious kitchen with the pricey coffee maker Michael had brought in from Italy. There was no longer a guest room for my sister to stay in when she came to visit. There was only a one-bedroom walk-up that screamed starting over in the worst way possible. I had to get a second job at a coffee shop just to make minimum payments on my credit cards because, as Michael had explained, when you open credit cards using your husband's income without his knowledge, they take a pretty dim view of that. Do you know how embarrassing it is to serve lattes to people wearing the kind of clothes you used to own? To see them check their designer watches while waiting for their orders, knowing you had to sell yours to make rent? That was the first time I tried to use my credit card at Nordstrom after moving out, and all of them were declined. In the meantime, I was living on ramen and rebranding coffee, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. My mom says I should have seen it coming. "You can't build a life on appearances," she told me during one of her lectures about responsibility and living within my means. Emma was promoted to regional manager for all of Michael's restaurants, which I learned about from a mutual friend who didn't know they weren't supposed to talk to me anymore. The worst part is that sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I catch myself wondering if I did this on purpose, like maybe some part of me knew the marriage was falling apart anyway, and it was easier to blow it up spectacularly than to admit I wasn't cut out for Michael's world. It's easy for her to say that because she's been wearing the same sensible shoes from Payless for the past 10 years. She doesn't understand what it's like to feel inadequate and to need those material possessions to feel worthy. It's been 6 months since I tried dating this guy from the coffee shop where I work, Trevor. He was sweet, always bringing me little treats from the baker next door, and he told me I was beautiful even in my polyester work uniform. However, he lived with 2 roommates and drove a beat-up Honda, and I couldn't help but compare him to Michael. How pitiful is it that I'm the one who messed everything up, and I still think I deserve better than a barista with student loans. Emma's car was in the parking lot, that sensible Subaru that probably gets gas mileage. I sat there for almost an hour, remembering when I used to be part of that world. Michael's doing great, by the way. Not that I'm stalking him or anything, but you hear things, you know. The 4th location is already turning a profit, to Ann Arbor. Last week, I drove past the main restaurant, telling myself it was because I was going to the grocery store, but that's a lie. In the meantime, I'm still making minimum payments on those credit cards. My therapist? Yeah, I finally started seeing one, but only because the court mandated it after Michael's lawyer brought up the stalking. Says I need to own my choices, like it's that simple. She wants me to make lists of my destructive behaviors and negative thought patterns, as if writing down compulsive shopping and paranoid tendencies is going to magically fix everything. The thing is, I do miss him. Not just the lifestyle, though God knows I miss that too, but the way he used to look at me before everything went wrong. Before Emma, before the debt, before I turned into this crazy person who tracked his phone and read his texts. Sometimes I wonder if he misses me too, but then I remember the look on his face that night at the restaurant, and I know better. My sister says I should write him a letter apologizing for everything. It might help me move on, she says. But what would I even say? Sorry I accused you of cheating? Sorry I maxed out secret credit cards? Sorry I couldn't handle feeling like I wasn't enough for your world? It all sounds so small now, so petty. The dating apps are a joke. Every time I match with someone, I find myself scrolling through their profile looking for red flags. Does he have a good job? Nice car? His own place? It's like I learned nothing. I'm still trying to shop for the perfect life. Only now I'm shopping for men instead of handbags. My new apartment doesn't feel like home. I've tried to make it cute. I bought some fake plants from Target and hung up some art prints, but everything in here reminds me of what I lost. The tiny closet that barely fits my remaining designer clothes, the kitchenette where I can't host dinner parties, and the view of the parking lot instead of our beautiful backyard. You want to know the really messed up part? Sometimes I still think it was partly his fault. If he hadn't been so wrapped up in his restaurants, if he hadn't hired Emma, if he had just paid more attention to me. But that's the thing about marriage. It's not just about attention or time or money, it's about trust. And I broke that long before I burst into his restaurant that night. People keep telling me it's a learning experience, a chance to grow as a person. But what if I don't want to grow? What if I just want my old life back? What if I'm not cut out for this whole self-improvement journey everyone seems to think I need? I saw Rachel at the grocery store the other day. She pretended not to see me, turning down another aisle with her cart full of organic vegetables and wine. I wanted to run after her to explain that I'm not the crazy person she thinks I am. But maybe I am. Maybe I'm exactly who everyone thinks I am. The jealous wife who blew up her marriage because she couldn't handle insecurities. So here I am, telling this story to whoever will listen, still not sure if I'm the villain or the victim. Maybe I'm both. Maybe that's what happens when you let your insecurities drive you to destroy the best thing in your life. You end up alone in a small apartment, working 2 jobs to pay off designer clothes you never should have bought, wondering if you'll ever find someone who makes you feel as safe as Michael did before you made him feel unsafe with you.